Ever feel like you're banging your head against a wall trying to overcome some kind of like impossible obstacle?
I think we've all been there.
Yeah. What if instead of just like brute force, there was a smarter way to approach those things? A way to almost let that obstacle kind of like crumble on its own?
That's a really intriguing idea.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
suggests a kind of strategic patience that we don't always think about, when we're facing a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And that is exactly what we are diving into today.
Okay.
This is based on, the insights that you were hoping to get from the 73 strategies of war.
Yes.
And we're focusing on this concept that Robert Greene lays out, which is this: maneuvering opponents into a position of weakness before you even like directly confront them at all.
Hmm.
The ripening for the sickle strategy.
Ripening for the sickle. It really kind of paints a picture in your mind, doesn't it? Like you're letting something develop towards an outcome that you already have in mind.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
kind of understanding this rhythm of strength and vulnerability and how that ebbs and flows.
Yeah. The core idea here
Yeah.
is that instead of charging headfirst into a fight, especially against someone stronger, a smarter move can be to patiently set the stage for their decline.
Uh-huh.
Let them use up their energy, let them make mistakes, let them essentially weaken themselves before you even really stepped into the ring.
That's a really fascinating kind of flip, isn't it, on how we normally approach things. Usually we want to go in with aggression and strength and break down defenses,
Yeah.
but this is almost like an invitation to let the opponent dismantle their own fortifications.
Right. And what's so compelling about this, I think, for you and me and for anyone who's facing a challenge, is that this isn't just about armies clashing on a battlefield.
Uh-huh.
This applies in business, it applies in leadership, it applies in how we navigate our personal relationships.
Right.
I mean, across the board.
Our tendency is to meet problems head on.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, this strategy is saying take a step back, analyze what's going on, look at the big picture and the forces that are already at work.
Right. And to kind of illustrate this, we dug into some really surprising examples, historical and modern, that I think really bring this concept to life.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into those.
Yeah, me too. So let's unpack this a little bit further, starting with truly, I think, a monumental historical example. The fall of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, the walls of Constantinople, they were legendary.
They were, for centuries, they were literally a symbol of impenetrability.
Right.
Like over 1,000 years, Constantinople's defenses had stood firm against countless attacks. Any kind of direct assault would have been so incredibly risky, a huge undertaking, probably a failure.
And that is where the Ottoman Empire's long game really comes into play.
Right.
They didn't just try to smash those gates down.
Right.
They embarked on this like much more kind of protracted and patient campaign.
Yeah.
And they very systematically started to choke off Constantinople's vital supplies, food, reinforcements, access to trade, all of it.
They realized that even the strongest physical barriers, the walls, the gates, are useless if the people behind them are weakened, if they don't have the resources to sustain themselves.
Exactly. And so year after year, this pressure just intensified. The city's resources dwindled, the population weakened. You can imagine the impact on morale.
Yeah.
It was devastating. So by the time the Ottomans finally did launch their major assault in 1453, the once mighty city was just a shell of its former self. They were depleted in numbers, low on supplies, and utterly exhausted.
It's just such a fascinating example of delayed gratification. They were incredibly patient. They had this clear vision of what they wanted in the long term.
Yeah.
They weren't after some, quick victory.
Right.
They wanted a lasting, decisive victory. And they achieved that by understanding that their opponent's strength had to be undermined over time.
And I think the key takeaway for us here, and this comes directly from Greene's work, is that even those challenges that seem utterly insurmountable right now can become much more vulnerable if you can strategically maneuver them into that position of weakness over time.
Precisely. It's not about immediate confrontation. It's about understanding vulnerabilities and then exploiting them strategically.
Okay, so we've seen the historical power of this kind of approach. Now let's dive into the core principles that Greene highlights in his book, The 33 Strategies of War, about this ripening for the sickle approach. And he lays out 3 key advantages, if I remember correctly.
He does, and I think they're really important to highlight. The first is minimal effort.
Okay.
When an adversary or a challenge has been weakened enough, that final push to achieve victory actually takes a lot less force. than if you were trying to take on a strong, prepared opponent from the get-go.
It's kind of the logic of don't pick a fight with someone at their peak.
Exactly.
Why exert all this energy against a fully charged force?
Exactly. And the second benefit that Greene emphasizes is reduced risks. When you avoid a direct clash with a powerful opponent, you are really lowering your own potential losses and setbacks.
Yeah.
You're not putting yourself in a position of unnecessary danger.
So it's about being strategic with your own resources as well.
Yes. Not just draining theirs, but conserving your own for when the odds are more in your favor.
Absolutely. And then the third advantage that he points to is this idea of long-term dominance.
Okay.
By shaping the conditions of the engagement, by orchestrating this weakening process, you're not just winning a single encounter, you're actually establishing control over the entire situation in the long run.
Yeah.
You're influencing the landscape, not just the immediate fight.
So you're setting yourself up for success down the road as well.
Exactly.
I love how these principles really resonate, especially when we think about, you, the listener, someone who's looking to gain valuable insights efficiently and not feel overwhelmed. This strategy is really about working smarter, not just harder. And that's what you're all about, right?
Absolutely. Understanding these principles can give you a real advantage. It's a valuable framework for approaching those complex challenges in a strategic and ultimately less taxing way. Okay, so we've looked at some historical stuff. We looked at the principles. Let's bring this into the modern world a little bit with a business example that I think really showcases this well. The ascent of Netflix and its impact on traditional television.
Oh, yeah. This is a classic example. It's a textbook example of indirect competition leading to a massive power shift.
Right.
Because you think about it, Netflix didn't start by trying to just outspend the major networks on content or acquire all the cable channels.
No, they didn't go head-to-head within that existing system.
They didn't.
They did something very different.
They did.
They patiently observed how the technological landscape was evolving, and they really capitalized on the growth of streaming technology. And while the traditional TV models remain kind of stuck in their old ways, tied to broadcast schedules and cable subscriptions, Netflix was quietly building a totally different kind of viewing experience.
They were creating almost a parallel universe of content consumption. While the traditional players were focused on, protecting what they already had, their infrastructure, their revenue streams, Netflix was cultivating this new audience.
Right.
With on-demand programming, a much more convenient way to watch.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. By the time these traditional cable companies and networks fully realized the monumental shift that was happening, Netflix had already amassed this massive subscriber base and this huge library of content.
They were dominant already.
They had become the dominant force
Right.
in this new landscape.
The attack, quote-unquote attack, wasn't on programming or distribution. It was this slow kind of exploitation of a changing environment that just made the old model less appealing and ultimately less relevant.
They let those traditional players become outdated by their own inertia.
Exactly.
And I think the parallel here is clear. Sometimes the most effective attack, the most powerful way to kind of overcome a competitor or a challenge is to be patient and allow those existing structures to weaken, even become obsolete, on their own over time.
It takes a lot of foresight and the ability to see beyond those immediate pressures of competition.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the bigger trends and positioning yourself to benefit from them as they play out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So we've seen how this works on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's bring this down to a personal level. How can the listener apply this ripening for the sickle strategy in their own life?
Okay, so on a personal level, this strategy is all about observation and timing.
Okay.
It's about carefully watching situations as they unfold, paying attention to the dynamics between people.
Yeah.
And identifying those vulnerabilities,
Wow.
whether that's, someone you're negotiating with or even an internal obstacle that you're trying to overcome.
So it's really about becoming a student of human behavior
Yes.
and just the natural flow of how things work.
Absolutely.
Not jumping in impulsively.
Right.
Taking your time to really understand the playing field.
And one of the big things it advises against is acting prematurely. Greene really emphasizes that impatience can sabotage a potential victory.
Right.
If you strike too soon, before your opponent is really weakened, you're just going to hit unnecessary resistance, and you might deplete your own resources too early.
We've all been there. Right. We've all done that. Rushed into a disagreement, tried to force a solution before the timing was right, and it just backfires spectacularly.
This is a reminder to resist that urge.
Yeah,
Bide your time. Look for those little subtle signs that things are shifting.
right.
Maybe there's a dip in someone's resolve.
Yeah.
Maybe they lack resources. Maybe there are internal conflicts that are starting to bubble up.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not just about observing weaknesses in others.
Right.
It's also about recognizing that optimal moment for you to act when your impact will be the greatest.
Yes. It's about finding that critical point where a small action at the right time can lead to a really significant outcome.
And I think to further solidify this idea of controlling the conditions strategically, let's go back to history again. Think about the U.S. strategy in the Pacific Theater during World War II.
Oh, yeah. This is another really strong example on a large scale of this ripening for the sickle at work.
Yeah.
The U.S. didn't immediately invade the Japanese mainland. I mean, that would have been insanely costly in terms of lives and resources.
Right. They didn't do that. Instead, they implemented a strategy of cutting off Japan's vital resources, primarily oil and food, through naval blockades and strategic bombing campaigns.
And the goal there was to cripple Japan's industry, their ability to make war.
Right.
By controlling the flow of supplies, the U.S. was essentially putting Japan in a chokehold.
And it really worked. Japan became increasingly desperate, their military capabilities were hampered by the loss of supplies, and their strategic options were extremely limited. And this gradual weakening that they orchestrated played a major role in forcing Japan into a losing position before those final devastating battles even took place.
It shows that you don't necessarily have to have these huge confrontations to achieve your goals.
Right.
Just controlling the circumstances around a conflict can heavily influence the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. But as with any strategy, there are pitfalls. And Greene gives us a really important warning here. Don't wait too long.
Yes,
There's a cautionary side to this ripening for the sickle idea.
there is.
While patience is key, hesitation can also be just as damaging.
Right.
Because if you wait too long, your opponent could regain their strength. They could adapt to the changing circumstances. They could even launch a preemptive move against you.
Absolutely. It's like a balancing act.
It is, yeah.
You have to allow for that weakening to occur, but you also have to be ready to act when the opportunity presents itself.
And I think maybe one of the most compelling examples of waiting too long, of becoming the one who is ripened for the sickle, is the story of Kodak and the digital revolution. What a classic example. Kodak, the giant of the film industry for so long, they actually invented the very technology that led to their downfall, the digital camera,
Yeah, back in the 70s.
back in the 70s. Unbelievable.
It's kind of ironic.
It is so ironic.
You can understand why they did it. They were afraid that digital photography would eat into their incredibly profitable film business.
Right.
So they made this decision to not really embrace digital photography, and they didn't aggressively pursue its development.
And as digital photography gained traction, the technology improved, consumer demand exploded, Kodak kind of stayed on the sidelines. Maybe they thought they could adapt later, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they thought, we'll just jump in when the time is right.
Right, we'll figure it out when we need to.
Exactly.
But by the time they finally tried to compete seriously in the digital market, everything had changed. New players had emerged.
They were behind the curve.
They were so far behind the curve, they ended up being this cautionary tale of a company that didn't act decisively when its own vulnerabilities were developing.
It really highlights that while you're waiting for an opponent to weaken, you can't forget about yourself.
All right.
You need to be aware of your own weaknesses and be willing to change and adapt.
Right.
Otherwise, you might become the one who gets overtaken.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that while you're waiting for that opponent to weaken, be acutely aware of your own weaknesses and be ready to adapt to changing circumstances.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you might end up being the one who gets cut down. Okay, so we've explored a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history, we've talked about the core principles, we've seen some really insightful examples of successes and failures. Now let's talk practical application.
Okay.
What are some concrete steps the listener can take to start applying this ripening for the sickle strategy in their own lives?
I think there are 5 main steps.
Great.
Number 1, you need to develop an eye for observation. So when you're looking at your challenges, your competitors, look for those subtle signs of weakness.
Right.
Whether it's a flaw in their strategy, a competitor's resolve, or just the inherent vulnerabilities of a situation.
Become like a strategic detective.
Exactly.
Always looking for the cracks in the armor.
Yes. Number 2 is actively resist that urge to engage or attack prematurely.
Okay.
Don't feel like you need to rush into things. Allow your opponent or the challenge to use up their resources, their energy, and make their own mistakes.
Let them fight their own battles.
Exactly. And those battles might even be internal battles.
Right. You conserve your energy for later.
Yes. And number 3 is apply pressure in a gradual and subtle way.
Okay.
You don't always need to go on the offensive. Sometimes small, consistent pressure over time is all you need.
Like a slow erosion that eventually weakens the foundation.
Exactly.
Right.
Number 4, cultivate patience, but always be ready to act when you see a weakness pop up.
So it's about being ready.
Yes. Don't miss the chance to capitalize on that.
Be ready to act when that moment is right.
Exactly. And finally, number 5, when the moment arrives, make sure you follow through and secure that advantage.
Right.
Don't give your opponent a chance to recover. Make that victory decisive.
Okay, I love those. And just to kind of bring this all home, let's look at one more modern business example
Okay.
that really ties everything together. Tesla and their impact on the established automotive industry.
Tesla is a really interesting modern case study because they show how strategic patience can pay off.
Right.
They didn't go head to head with the big car companies on internal combustion engines.
No, they didn't try to build a better gas-powered car than Ford or GM.
Right.
They did something totally different.
They did.
They focused on electric vehicle technology, which at the time was a much smaller market.
It was a niche market at the time.
Right.
They were really playing the long game.
And I think they were strategically waiting for several key factors to kind of come together.
Yeah.
You know, growing concern about climate change, increasing government regulations that favored electric vehicles, and that slow but steady rise in consumer interest in EVs. And of course, they benefited from the fluctuations in gas prices, which often went up, making those electric vehicles more attractive.
Absolutely.
So while those big automakers were still really heavily invested in their gas-powered cars and their existing manufacturing, Tesla was building their brand, advancing their EV technology, and developing their charging network.
They were waiting for their moment.
Yeah, they're patiently waiting for the opportune moment. And then when demand for electric vehicles started to surge, Tesla was in a perfect position.
They were ready.
They were so ready. They were a leader in the market. They had innovative technology. They had a strong brand identity. And all those traditional automakers were suddenly scrambling to catch up.
They had to completely shift their operations. It was a huge challenge for them.
Yeah. And it's just this perfect illustration of maneuvering your competitors into a position where their strengths actually become liabilities. Their decline in the face of that market shift was almost inevitable.
They didn't overpower the giants. They waited for the market to change in their favor.
Right.
And then they took advantage of their competitors' weaknesses.
Okay, so to bring it all together, the central takeaway from our deep dive today is that there's immense power in being strategically patient and maneuvering your challenges, your competitors, even your own internal obstacles into this position of weakness before you ever directly engage with them. Timing, keen observation, and applying controlled pressure. These are crucial elements of this approach.
It's a more nuanced approach. It's often less confrontational, but I think ultimately it's far more effective for reaching your goals.
Yeah, I agree.
It does require a shift in perspective. You have to
Yeah.
be willing to play the long game, and you have to understand all the different forces at work.
Absolutely. So as you go about pursuing your goals, and we all face challenges, think about if there are areas where you can apply this ripening for the sickle strategy. It might just be that more effective, less stressful route to success.
Yeah. Instead of just charging in, think about where you can create the conditions for a more effortless victory.
Exactly. I encourage you to really reflect on those examples we talked about today, from ancient history to modern business, and think about how you can apply this strategic thinking to your own interests and the situations that you're dealing with right now.
Think about your own past. Were there times when a more patient approach might have led to a better result?
It's a great way to learn from your experiences and make better choices in the future.
Absolutely.
Maneuver them into weakness. Sometimes that's the strongest move of all.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I'm excited to see where we go next time.
Me too. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, this is great.